Hi all. We're going to be continuing to examine the early modern continent of Africa this week, continuing at the beginning of the week where we left off last week with West Central Africa, and then towards the end of this week we're going to look at the Swahili-speaking trade ports in East Africa. Today's subject, the farmers and traders of West Central Africa. West Central Africa, so we're talking about this is where we were much of last week, and then we started off talking about West Central Africa. That is the region right here. All right. So West Central Africa has been called by some historians the land of blacksmith kings. This is in no small part because, as we know, human interaction in the region was partly defined by long-term control over copper and iron deposits. As in West Africa, however, the vast majority of the population were engaged in subsistence agriculture. Now, this would normally mean tilling. In other words, tilling stuff by hand, because the tsetse fly, this beastie down here, which, as we recall from last week, is the carrier of trypanosomiasis, or African sleeping sickness, that disease, thanks to the tsetse fly, killed all the livestock that could pull plows. So as a result, most people who farmed were doing so by hand, and very few people other than hunter-gatherers actually inhabited the vast majority of the great equatorial forests of the region. So here's the equator. This is West Central Africa here, and the equatorial forests are this green band right there. One of the more famous examples of a society that is hunter-gatherer and does very well in the equatorial forests of this region are the famous pygmy societies. We have a modern image of one group of pygmies in the lower central corner of your screen. However, most of the folks living in West Central Africa and near it tended to prefer to farm the savannas, which are the grasslands around this forested equatorial region. They also preferred to, where they were not able to farm, they would fish along the coasts or up in the great river basins or other bodies of water in the area. The major river basin is the Congo River Basin, which today is called Zaire. This river basin, all of the associated bodies of water and its estuary, which remember the estuary is where it empties into the ocean, is second only to the Amazon in terms of forest cover and the volume of freshwater catchment involved. In other words, it's a huge river basin with a lot of water and a lot of forest cover. And as a result, all the bodies of water associated with the river basin are centrally important in West Central African history. Now, the patterns of belief and material culture in West Central Africa varied in the early modern period, but most people spoke some language that had derived from the ancestral root tongue of Western Bantu. As for religion, we know that by the time we get to the early modern period, Islam is in some areas of the region, but it was sort of marginal in its influence in West Central Africa, unlike its impact further to the north and the west. Most inhabitants of West Central Africa lived in kin-based villages. Some of these were matrilineal, others patrilineal, and a small minority of villages were subordinate either to paramount chiefs or to lesser kings. So there's a fair amount of variance in cultural structure, political organization, and religious belief in West Central Africa in the early modern period. But despite these variations, the region was marked by a cultural coherence similar to that of Mesoamerica. In other words, despite everything that made them different, most of them could communicate with each other linguistically and had enough of a cultural coherence based on language that there was a means of getting along with each other if they weren't in direct conflict. The agriculturalists in West Central Africa grew a variety of crops. Grains mostly would have been millet and sorghum. This is what millet looks like. Some areas also had crops of yams and bananas. Bananas were actually introduced into West Central Africa sometime before the year 1000. This is a crop that would enable farmers to exploit the forest's edge much more effectively, and it also allowed them to devote more energy to textile making and other activities because bananas are a fairly nutrient-rich food, and all you have to do is wait for the palms to pollinate and grow fruit. There's not a lot of tending to do to them once they are established. Some forested areas were and remain too wet for crops, but they still offered things like wild game, medicinal plants, and so on. Pygmy forest dwellers, for example, would trade honey and ivory and animal pelts to the farming folk who were neighboring on the forest, and in exchange for their honey, ivory, and furs, they would receive iron points and food items. The only region of West Central Africa where the tsetse fly did not prevent animal husbandry was the drier southern plains of what is now called Angola. This region marked out right here on the map. In this region, livestock did survive well, but the consistency of rainfall remained highly uncertain. So, in other words, it's a good place for livestock because there's no tsetse fly, and because the soil can't be maintained as moist enough due to uncertain rainfall for crop growing. So it's a place where livestock was generally husbanded, if you will, raised. After the arrival of Europeans in West Central Africa, the residents of the region began to embrace a host of new crops. Maize became a staple throughout Central Africa. Now, of course, what's interesting about that is it had to be conveyed from South America and Central America over to Africa by the Europeans. So it gives us a sense of the order in which the contact with West Central Africa occurred, right? They also gained cassava, which is also known as manioc, also from the New World, peanuts, chili peppers, beans, squash, and tobacco, all of which, again, are from the New World. This, by the way, is what cassava looks like, or manioc looks like, still on the plant. So West Central Africa's ties to global trade were certainly less direct than the ties of coastal West Africa up in the north and west of the region we're talking about, right? So this region's ties to global trade were much less direct than this region's ties to global trade, but the fact that they had access to and began to readily grow all of these crops tell us West Central Africa was still a part of this global trade system. The same can also be said of the involvement of in internal African trade. That is to say that the folks living in this region were just as involved with trading in the interior of Africa as they were other types of trade. As in West Africa, salt was traded over great distances in West Central Africa, so also were food products, textiles, metal goods, and raffia palm fiber, among other items. Throughout the region, political power came to be associated with control over these trade goods, the trade routes they traveled, or both. For example, in about 1300, two kingdoms arose, both above and below Malebo Pool, which is right alongside the Congo or Zaire River. The location of Malebo Pool is also the location of the first major cataract or high waterfall if you were traveling by boat up the river heading inland. That means that anyone traveling from the coast towards the interior of the region had to exit the vessel, pull the vessel and all of its contents out of the water, portage or carry the vessel around the cataract, and then set it back into the water and continue on upstream. The kingdom to the south of the river became known as the Kingdom of Congo. This is a name that was given to the kingdom accidentally by the Portuguese, who named it after the title given to its warlords. The warlords were called Monacongos. And just as the Muslim traders in the northwest of this region up in West Africa had mistaken the title of the war chief of the kingdom, Ghana, the war chief was called Ghana, right? And they had mistaken that for the name of the entire region. So also here the Portuguese made the mistake of assuming that the title of the warlords, Monacongos, applied to the entire kingdom. So it became known as the Kingdom of Congo. The leaders of this kingdom came to power in part by monopolizing copper deposits. Remember that copper was a major medium of exchange in the area. These kings also controlled access to cowrie shells, which you will recall are the area's main form of currency. The kingdom to the north of that river, outlined now in blue on your slide, is the kingdom of Luango. The kings of Luango lived north of the falls, but they controlled access to the Atlantic coast. They therefore taxed the trade along this river, and they drew legitimacy for their power from their role as caretakers of an ancient religious shrine that was positioned along the north edge of the river within Luango territory.